this can. All right, so we're back at the cracks in postmodernity. Today, I'm going to be asking Pieter Valk about an essay that he wrote for the Cracks and Pomo Substack entitled From Pray the Gay Away to Pansexual Pragmatism. And then he's going to be asking me about the essay I wrote for his Substack, From Drag to Dime Square, The Return of the Homo Fascist. So, Peter, for those who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself and then give us a little bit of a summary of the essay that you wrote for us.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on the podcast, Stephen. It's been fun to do this little
Yes.
collaboration that we've been doing over the past couple weeks. So I am a writer and speaker about vocational singleness and LGBT plus topics according to kind of historic Christian sexual ethic. And I help lead a ministry called Equip that has is does consulting and training with churches who want to become places where LGBT plus people can thrive according to a historic Christian sexual ethic, and we've trained over 35,000 Christian leaders over the past decade. And then I'm also a licensed professional counselor, and I meet primarily with people navigating questions of faith and gender and sexuality. I am I guess denominationally like I'm an Anglican, so I'm actually in the uh, ordination exploration process in the Anglican churches in North America. And then maybe another odd bit about me is that I actually live in a modern monastery. I'm a part of a intentional Christian community called the Nashville Family of Brothers, and we're building family for Christian men in Nashville who feel called to long-term singleness and are looking for a place to find kind of the family that can make their faithfulness in their celibacy and also in their kingdom work possible. And then maybe I'll say that all of this work kind of matters to me, and I do all this different stuff in my life because I'm a Christian, because I'm gay, and because I myself am convinced of historic Christian sexual ethic for all people, including me. And I feel that God's called me to walk that out in lifetime vocational singleness, singleness for the sake of kingdom work. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. But yeah, the article is about kind of this strange moment we're in where it feels like there's like two very different narratives about queerness and marriage running side by side. So like on the one hand, there's this shiny new version, at least in my opinion, of ex-gay therapy rebranding itself as reintegrative therapy, created by Joe Nicolosi Jr., the son of the guy who literally invented conversion therapy. And then on the other hand, there's this massive uptick in Gen Z and Gen Alpha identifying as LGBTQ plus, especially pansexual, and people saying, hey, I care more about the person than the plumbing, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um, and being open to dating folks that they're not most physically attracted to, which means they're saying yes to the exact kind of relationship that the ex-gay movement has been pushing for decades for totally different reasons. So I wanted to try to make sense of that tension. As someone who myself, I survived that kind of original flavor of pray the gay away therapy, unfortunately. And now I work as a licensed therapist and I train pastors and I walk with queer Christians. So I've been watching this kind of new wave of reintegrative therapy with a mix of deja vu and alarm. And because the therapy markets itself as not conversion therapy, quote unquote, but still sets people up to expect orientation change. Like they say it's trauma informed and it's just about healing attachment wounds, but their own promotional graphics on their website admit that a shift in sexual orientation is often the outcome. Which I think is like saying you're not selling snake oil, just really effective essential oils that also happen to cure cancer,
Mhm.
uh, in my opinion. So anyway, in the article, I kind of describe how those therapy spaces worked for me, how those XK therapy spaces kind of charted my weekly opposite sex attractions and same sex attraction
Mhm.
levels, and tried to reenact my trauma and even had supervised golden father holding sessions with handouts for how to cuddle with other men appropriately. And just, I point to kind of how all of that, unsurprisingly, didn't change my sexual orientation, but it did deepen my shame and my anxiety and my addiction. But there's also some surprising good that came out of all of that, which was I also recognize in the process that I am capable of love with women, even though I'm not generally bisexual. You know, that I dated women in college, was open about my sexuality, even fell in love twice. My orientation didn't change, but I did learn that I could be emotionally and romantically available for a marriage with the right kind of woman, with a lot of honesty, without having to pretend. And that's the key. I think what makes a mixed orientation marriage, an opposite sex marriage, where one of the people experiences same sex attraction, what makes that work and isn't orientation change is that it's transparent, that there's a shared vocation and there's a choosing each other for kind of sober, holy reasons. And that's really where the next like Gen Z and Gen Alpha comes in. And I'll wrap up my synopsis here. But we're seeing really big generational shifts right now. Like in just 6 years, the percentage of teens identifying as LGBTQ plus has more than doubled. Pansexual identification in particular is surging. And I think what I find most fascinating isn't just the like increase in queerness, but the way Gen Z and Gen Alpha are redefining how they think about attraction and relationships. They're they're less interested in chasing a soulmate who makes their heart race and more interested in cultivating like honest, mutual, resilient relationships. They're seeing the failures of romance idolatry, the divorce, the porn, the sex without intimacy, and they're skeptical. For a lot of them, sexual chemistry isn't the foundation of a relationship. You know, it's just one variable among many, which means they're actually open to the kinds of relationships the conservative Christians have spent decades trying to engineer through orientation change. But these are relationships based on transparency, friendship, shared purpose. And the only difference is that Gen Z isn't faking it. It's pretty cool to see all of that. And maybe we'll get to a little bit later, but I have some advice, for the church in terms of how we can support Gen Z and Gen Alpha who might be open to mixed orientation marriages, and also maybe have some advice for the queer Christian who themselves might be curious about a mixed orientation marriage. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
what the piece got at a little bit.
Yeah, so this is one of the several things that I found interesting while editing your piece is that okay, there are very few people who are able to criticize both traditional reparative conversion therapy and this new form of it, reintegrative therapy. Um, but also recognize that mixed orientation marriage is it's a valid experience. It's a valid thing to pursue. And I think like your reasoning is not like the reason why you're critical of those types of therapy is not because oh like it's trying to make somebody it's yeah, like it's not this criticism of the desire to pursue an opposite sex relationship, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could, like, if that's what your vocation is, that's what your calling is, then great. But it's under what terms is somebody pursuing that type of relationship? Is it this fantasy of quote unquote changing one's orientation? This, seeking out this promise of getting quote unquote fixed. You see how psychologically, but also spiritually, like that kind of goal is damaging and also unrealistic.
Mhm.
Whereas, I mean, your approach when you talk about, people who pursue mixed orientation marriages in a healthy way is very different. And I think very few people pick up on that nuance. So I want to ask if you could explain a little bit more, like what is like in your work with people who have pursued mixed orientation marriages, like what is different about that kind of approach that you were talking about that isn't about changing who you are, trying to attain some kind of unrealistic goal, but like I don't know, like because again, I don't think a lot of people know that there are other approaches out there. So tell us more about that kind of approach to the mixed orientation marriage.
Yeah. And in some ways, it's based on what I've observed from friends and clients who have been in ultimately successful or unsuccessful mixed orientation marriages, what seem to be the common factors, and then kind of reverse engineer from there. And so what I notice is that regardless of whether or not these mixed orientation marriages end up getting divorced, it's rarely because they're not having sex with each other, the spouses, right? That's not the problem. What tends to lead to divorce or not is if they if the person didn't share with their spouse before they got married about their enduring same-sex attractions. Maybe because they believed themselves that if I just get married, those attractions will go away. Maybe they were told by a pastor that. They were told not to tell their spouse that this is a part of your story because it's going to go away and so it's not going to be relevant anyway. Or they start dating this person of the opposite sex, and temporarily it feels like their same-sex attractions subside,
Mhm.
and they tell their spouse, "Oh well, my same-sex attractions are starting to go away because we're dating now," and promise or set up this expectation that they're going to permanently be lessened or they're going to go away. And then, when the marriage gets stressful and stress and challenges in life leads to perhaps those same-sex attractions kind of returning in a more robust way, they feel like they had to hide those from their spouse. Um, so when there's hiding of the sexual orientation and this and attractions even within the marriage, that hiding is the perfect recipe for a barrier to intimacy between the two spouses,
Right.
to them then them feeling lonely, and then them reaching out for kind of unsatisfying low-hanging fruit alternatives, or if they are kind of being honest within their marriage about the temptations that they're dealing with, but they don't talk to any other couple about what's some of these elements of their marriage. And then it's easy for them to be tempted to believe that every challenge in their marriage is because one of them experiences same-sex attraction. Okay. So in contrast, what's like the recipe for doing this well? One, when as someone even begins dating someone of the opposite sex, be transparent about same-sex attractions. Set up, be clear that I'm probably going to experience these same-sex attractions for the rest of my life, and if we ever get serious, managing these is gonna we're brothers and sisters in Christ. If we got serious about doing something together, part of doing life together would be supporting each other in our stewardship of all of our temptations. This is going to be one of mine that I'm always going to deal with. This would be a team effort kind of thing. And then be transparent, not with they don't have to put it on Facebook that they're in a mixed orientation marriage, or put it on X, or put it on TikTok or whatever, but like with their at least closer inner circle of friends and family and whatnot, be transparent about this element of their marriage, or of their kind of serious dating relationship getting into the marriage, and then continue having those conversations inside and outside of the marriage once married. That seems to be the recipe for healthy. And so in part what I'm saying is if people are trying to get opposite sex married to pass as straight, that's a shorthand for like the recipe for disaster. But if they want to be authentic with themselves and with God and with their spouse and with their close community about what their sexual orientation is, and feel called to opposite sex Christian marriage and want to do that faithfully and with transparency, that's a good recipe for faithfulness.
Because it also seems like with conversion therapy or reparative therapy, the emphasis is on the emphasis is on like your agenda, like the goal that you establish for yourself and the effort that you're making to get there. Whereas what you're talking about is you're putting the emphasis on the vocation, on God's calling you, and through grace helping you to say yes to this calling that He's giving you, and that your spouse, your community is helping you along the way. But it's like there's a certain freedom that comes from, I'm pursuing this marriage because I feel called. God is asking me to say yes to this path along with people who are supporting me versus I need to reach this goal that I set for self and I need for myself and I need to try really hard. Like there's no freedom in that. Like this is why people, you know, either leave or have emotional breakdowns or like, it's to put all that pressure on yourself is like there's clearly something unhealthy about it. Um,
Right.
but I'm wondering if you can say a little bit, like, if you're open to it, of saying something about your experience of coming out of conversion therapy and like coming to discover that, that approach wasn't helpful for your own growth, for your own spiritual life. Like, what was that like, kind of coming to terms with what had happened in that experience?
Yeah, it was messy because it was a season of trying to figure out like not everything that I learned and that I experienced in some of those XK spaces was bad.
Hmm.
Not everything was harmful. There was some really helpful aspects of those experiences. There were some good friendships that I developed in those spaces. So it's not all bad. So part of it was not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, disentangling what were the sources of kind of over-promising and kind of in some ways continuing to cultivate internalized homophobia for me, and what were the spaces where I was learning how to think about masculinity in healthier ways. I was learning to recognize my needs for healthy, intimate friendship with other men and lean into that in healthy ways. What were the ways that it was challenging me to be open to the possibility of a mixed orientation marriage, even if I don't experience the same kind of carnal desire for women as I do for men. So some of it was like teasing out what was the good and the bad from that experience. And I think in some ways the really pivotal moment for me was I spent 9 months actually interning for a Pray the Gay Away ministry
Wow.
during the 1 year, 9 month kind of season in which the ministry imploded.
Oh,
Unfortunately, and some of that because of the stuff going on in the ministry director's personal life, who was in a mixed orientation marriage that during that year, the marriage imploded. Um, and so I saw very close up like what kind of what's not working about kind of this pray the gay away solution, not only for like this leader that I admired, but also for me and also the people that this ministry was serving. Um, and also saw how not to run a ministry in some ways.
hmm.
So, but it was a painful, weird season.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but the other thing that I'm thinking about is how much I guess, like, historical cultural circumstances that we're in have led to this kind of openness to I don't know, to this fluidity, this kind of like Gen Z pansexuality that we're seeing. Because
Mhm.
on one hand, like, okay, now you have gay marriage legalized. There's less pressure to really push this narrative that, like, I am, I'm born this way, this is who I am, and nothing's ever going to change that. And like, part of the reason why people held to that narrative is because they wanted to push for certain, legal policies.
Mhm.
Now that that's in place, I think people feel more free to be like, oh, I mean, maybe I'm mostly attracted to men, but I also, you never know, maybe I like women, or maybe, like, there's this fluidity, this kind of openness, this not this kind of like hard line attachment to these clearly defined categories. But then there's the other thing you mentioned about this disillusion with the romantic ideal. Like, people know that you're, this sense that, like, you're going to fall madly in love with someone and spend your whole life with them. Like, that's not how it works. Like, if you're going to really spend your life with someone, there has to be a real foundation that you build. And like, romance alone never works. Um, so I don't know. It's interesting how, like, how the times are changing. And I think Gen Z is seeing all these things going on. And thus they're open to these various possibilities. So
Mhm.
obviously, yeah, like, you have some that are clearly not in congruence with a traditional kind of Christian worldview, a Christian ethic.
Sure.
But that fluidity, that openness does dispose some to pursuing something that is more traditional, more in line with, a calling from God.
Yeah.
So yeah, so like, say a little bit more about what you observe happening, like these generational cultural
Wow.
shifts and how that's kind of changing the way we talk about these things.
Yeah, interestingly, I think that we are approaching kind of a cultural environment as it relates to marriage and sexuality that is much more similar to the first century ancient Near East. It's like
Hmm.
I think the scriptures are just going to become more and
Interesting.
more relevant in some ways because I don't know this even this whole like concept of like sexual identity is only like 150 years old, right? Or something like that. Um, and so at first, when kind of the concept of cultural sexual identity gets established, the mantra is um, everyone is supposed to be straight, and some people are gay. What do we do about that, right? Then,
Hmm.
in some ways, the success of the kind of gay marriage rights movement was to say some people are gay and some people are supposed to be gay and some people are supposed to be straight
Hmm.
and we should be in our lanes and it's okay to be in our lanes. And then in many ways what like more like Gen Z and Gen Alpha kind of people who identify as queer, how they think about these things is kind of like, okay, I'm some kind of vaguely in the queer alphabet space, but who cares?
Hmm.
Like and I'm not going to choose who my companion is based on having to diagnose what percent gay versus bisexual versus straight I am, and then I can only date people in this certain lane based on that sexual orientation, yada yada yada. So, and this kind of okay, so I desire lots of different kinds of people and some more than others. What of it?
Hmm.
I'm still going to choose who I want to do relationship with. That's exactly first century ancient Near East, right? Like they didn't have this
Hmm.
conception of being, you know, having a sexual identity, but they were very aware that there were people having gay sex. There were people who maybe preferred same-sex sexual intimacy more than opposite-sex sexual intimacy. And they didn't think as much when they thought of marriage, they didn't think of something that was driven primarily by who are you most romantically or sexually drawn to, but instead, is there a mission, a vocation,
Hmm.
either from your community or from your family or from God that you're being called to step into when it comes to marriage? And then yeah, you're probably attracted to all kinds of people and have all kinds of opportunities available. Then your job is to steward those temptations and those possibilities faithfully, but none of us are pretending like those aren't available to us if we did tap into them. And we're not shaming each other about being interested in those things.
Yeah.
So,
So the last thing I'll ask, and then we can maybe flip things around.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me to see how, like, within the larger discourse, even in the secular world, I see the way we're talking about things changing. Like I see non-religious folk who are more open to this fluidity, to like different ways of living one's sexuality. What do you observe when you're talking about these things within religious spaces? How are these ideas, these observations you're seeing received when you talk about it with people in churches?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that I mean, there's all particularly when it comes to LGBT plus stuff and marriage and the solution, quote unquote, is a pendulum swing, right? Like back during the 90s and aughts when XK stuff was big, the solution for every gay Christian was to essentially get in a mixed orientation marriage. Then I think as the failures of like the Pray the Gay Away movement became more obvious in the late aughts and then the 2010s, and maybe even up until now, a lot of kind of Christian spaces that hold a more kind of historic Christian sexual ethic, but have seen the failures of a lot of mixed orientation marriages have almost overcorrected in the opposite direction and
Mm.
said, "Oh no, 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 that couldn't possibly be fair to the opposite sex spouse who is straight. So the only option for gay Christians is celibacy." Um, and then now, and then now perhaps we're swinging back towards the middle, or kind of there's another course correction. Um, I see a variety of things in different kind of denominational spaces, but I can at least share what my hope would be. My hope would be that our churches would have transparent, age-appropriate conversations before puberty about the reality of sexual brokenness of all kinds in our world and in our lives, and would invite teens, hey, if any of this stuff is ever your story, you can share with us early. You don't have to make sense of this alone. There's no shame. we believe God has good wisdom for you, but we're not going to try to change you into some other kind of person.
Mm.
Um, and then our churches teach about vocational singleness and teach about Christian marriage and teach about both of them as being possibilities for both gay people and straight people and queer people and whatever people. Like those are God's vocations for his people, for all of his people. And we don't hide the possibility of mixed orientation marriages, but we don't overhype the possibility of mixed orientation marriages.
Yeah.
We don't hide the possibility of vocational singleness for straight or gay people, but we don't overhype it either. If we don't fetishize it, we don't teach it as being holier than Christian marriage. I think that's like the secret sauce, and that's what I hope more of our churches lean into doing.
Okay. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, so okay, so kind of turning to your piece, when you first pitched the idea of an essay focusing on homofascism, obviously just like the word itself is an exciting by exciting I don't mean necessarily in a positive way. I mean it's an eye-opening word. Just that word. Tell me about the piece, what you're hoping to get at, what you've been noticing, what you want to raise some alarm bells around, and what maybe you can teach us.
Yeah. So, I mean, for context, like growing up in the 90s and early aughts, like you have this, you're kind of taught that no, the defense of gay rights, all things LGBT related, is a progressive cause. It's a left-wing thing. It's the Democrats who voted in gay marriage. It's liberal families who are accepting of their kids. So you associate pro-gay with the left, anti-gay with the right in very simplistic terms. But I started to see within recent years that the paradigm is changing, in part because gay marriage is legalized. So, now that that's out of the way, people are talking about homosexuality very differently. And I think ultimately, again, like as a Christian, but even if I weren't Christian, like I think just biologically speaking, we all know that there is something distinct about homosexuality. It's not the same thing as heterosexuality. And I think, again, we only said love is love and, everything is equal for the sake of political expediency. I don't think anyone truly believes they're exactly the same. Even people who like, I reference Camille Paglia in like everything I write usually. But even she who's not a Christian, who considers herself a kind of neo-pagan of sorts, she celebrates homosexuality, but she says it's extremely different from heterosexuality. Again, just from a
Mhm.
purely biological, natural point of view. So I think people now feel more free to recognize and talk about that difference. And then it's also created space for people um, to kind of tap into like, okay, well, what are those different implications of homosexuality, homosexual sex? Um, it's not, I mean, when you really think about the sexual dynamic between two people of the same sex, like there is this conflict with nature, there's this clash with the norm, but there's also this dynamic of power,
Mm.
which I don't know, like complementary heterosexual sex. Sure, there could be a focus on it, like some kind of power imbalance within those relationships, but ontologically speaking, there is this complementarity, there's this harmony. I think some gay people are tapping into the sense of conflict, the sense of power, the sense of transgression, and recognizing how, yeah, like it is linked in some way to certain forms of authoritarian government. It can be congruent with certain fascistic, if not fascistic politics, then at least fascistic aesthetics.
Mm.
So what I did was kind of look at the historical precedents that this has. Like if you look at Nazi Germany, there were certain gay Nazi soldiers who thought that, not only was it okay to be gay, but like there is something positive about practicing homosexuality
Mm.
within, kind of authoritarian militaristic context. But then you have people today, like you have Milo Yiannopoulos, you have Bronze Age pervert, who are promoting some kind of iteration of this homo-fascist
Yeah.
ideal. And again, it's this idea that, especially for men, the strong, beautiful man is the ideal. The weak, the feminine, like there's something they look down upon. Um, so I don't know. I tried to kind of like do a little history of it, see how it's cropping up today, and then offer a Christian critique.
Yeah.
How do we make sense of this? Is there something positive we can take away? How does this go against what we believe? That's kind of what I was trying to get at this.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things you mention is kind of uh that there's an appetite maybe today for a certain kind of homofascism among some people because there's something lacking in modern liberalism. Like
Mhm.
that there's something about the homofascist critique of modern liberalism that is right, even if homofascism isn't the right answer. And you kind of encourage Christians not to like throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to like that homo-fascist critique of modern liberalism. Yeah, what's the baby?
Yeah.
What's the bathwater? What does this like aesthetic revival or like philosophical reaction get right?
Yeah. So the thing is, like, I tried to kind of link this phenomenon to this whole the dime square phenomenon.
Hmm.
Which, in a sense, like it's this recovery of a decadent aesthetic rendering of Christianity that I think is ultimately a distortion of what Christianity is,
Hmm.
while at the same time being an attempt to recover. You're recovering a piece of Christianity without looking at the whole picture. You're recovering the sense that Christianity, especially like more high liturgical kind of in high liturgical spaces, um, there is this attention to beauty. There's this attention to grandeur, to mystery, that being in a very kind of secularized, liberal space, a disenchanted space, like there's something extremely attractive about that. There's something that kind of allows you to breathe and be human once again. To recognize that, like, I am made for the transcendent. I do desire this kind of beauty, this something that transcends the norm,
Hmm.
transcends, the respectable liberal bourgeois norm. Um, I think that should be a door that opens up to the fullness of the truth, which is that Christ loved us enough to give up his life and calls us to follow, to take up the cross and follow his path, to give ourselves out of love for him and for the sake of humanity. My fear is that a lot of these kind of decadent aesthetic Christians lose sight of the bigger picture. It becomes a kind of performance of like, oh, look, we're edgy, we're transgressive, we're not following the liberal secular norms.
Hmm.
Like if it's just that, then this is silly. But so this is why I'm like, okay, let's not discount this phenomenon. So the same with homofascism. I think a lot of people are disillusioned with this very what I call the identitarian narrative. Like, Lady Gaga, you're born this way, love is love, you can't choose who you love. Um, and yes, like homophobia, gay people are oppressed. We have to fight homophobia. Of course, there's something true here. Of course, I mean, no one should be treated badly because of, certain experiences, certain conditions they have that are not, that they didn't ask, they didn't bring upon themselves. People should not be beaten up and, have their rights taken away because for any reason. Um, but if that's what we're going to reduce homosexuality to, a mere identity, a mere oppressed identity, a victimized group, then you lose sight of the real depth of homoerotic desire and the experience of queerness. I think, again, now that gay marriage is legal, people feel much more free to say, hey, there's more to the picture here. Um, this is part of why you have people go swinging the pendulum to the other extreme, saying, actually, not only am I against this kind of liberal, secularized narrative of homosexuality, I'm going to go to this fascistic, authoritarian one.
Hmm.
So I think, okay, let's reject this kind of authoritarian politic, this kind of misogynistic bent of homofascism, which obviously runs contrary to everything in Christianity. But let's recover this sense that, okay, like there is something distinct about homosexuality. Homoerotic desire does have this deeper, greater significance, which can lead to very dark things, can lead to things that are contrary to God's design for us, but could also be a means to enter more deeply into the cross, enter more deeply into, Christ's suffering, into our own vocations. So I think like all for breaking through this kind of neutralized, sanitized way of
Yeah,
talking about sexuality, but I'm not going to swing the pendulum all the other way because that's not what God wants ultimately. Yeah.
sure, sure. Yeah, how much of this is like fairly parallel to, you know, many kind of in maybe like the manosphere space would say that our society has made masculinity bad,
Mhm.
has made it so that it's not a value neutral thing or a value positive thing, like masculinity is a bad thing, and then are reacting to that with kind of, and it might even be an accurate criticism, but then are reacting to that with hypermasculinity
Mhm.
or toxic masculinity in some spaces. How much of this is just like the gay version of that? um like that, but this is like gay toxic masculinity equals homofascism. Is that like, I know that's an oversimplification, but
No, I don't think it's an oversimplification. First of all, like I think any reaction, I think reactionary discourse is like already faulty because its point of departure is the thing it doesn't like. Like it doesn't offer an original new position to
yeah,
counter the opposition. It's like there's a thing I oppose, and now I'm going to talk about how much I hate it. Like that's not a real position. You're not offering anything substantial. So with this whole like manosphere stuff, it's like, okay, you're tired of this kind of liberal feminism, men are oppressors and women need to like be powerful. The solution is not like, yeah, hyper masculinity and we're going to be tough again and we're going to you know, slong frog eggs and like lift, do power lift. Like, okay, that's not real masculinity. It's this kind of like performance to signal your opposition to the liberal narrative. But I do have to say, like, within that kind of like reactionary manosphere discourse, there is something very homoerotic about it because you're creating this fetish out of this kind of superficial performative masculine ideal. um, Whereas like I think true masculine, like yeah, I do think there's something true about this idea that like there's something good about men being strong, men having, being resilient, being able to protect and defend others. Never for its own sake. Like I don't think men should lift weights and be tough to prove that they're men. I think you do that for the sake of fulfilling your calling, especially if you're a father. Like you want to be able to take care of your family. You want to defend them physically if it ever comes to that. But again, you don't lift so you can prove that you're a tough man, like, and that you have like this is where it becomes kind of gay. Like you're
right.
lifting because you want to prove you have big muscles and a hot body. That's no, there's something very homoerotic about that.
Yeah, I have so when I was in graduate school, the for counseling, the only other guy in our graduate school program, he was straight and very comfortable with his sexuality and very comfortable with my story. But also part of his background is he was like a NCAA wrestler, and then once he was done with wrestling, like just for fun, like went into like bodybuilding and particularly like aesthetic bodybuilding as like a hobby. But he was
Mhm.
very self-aware about like what was odd about those spaces. And he would often joke like there's nothing gayer than a bunch of straight men in the gym like looking in their mirror next to each other, complaining about what they don't like about their body, complimenting another guy about his body and touching him. And
See,
I thought it was so
yeah,
funny, his like self-awareness about it, his like, and how much they yearn to be complimented by the other straight men
yeah,
in the gym for their body, right? It just, his self-awareness about it, I thought was comical at the time, but it
yeah.
speaks to what you're saying.
No, but that's the thing though. It's like on one hand, you're fetishizing this ideal of masculinity, creating an idol out of it in a way, but also this sense that like maybe this is a little too, I don't know, like too much of a stereotype, but like to be this concerned about your appearance, I don't think it's a very masculine thing. Like I think it is a little bit more feminine. So like the fact that you're bodybuilding for the sake of showing off, like this makes me think of, I mean, the recent season of White Lotus. Like you see this
Mm.
they have the brothers who the one is like, this kind of macho guy and he's trying to influence his younger brother to start lifting and, drinking protein shakes and all that. And then the brother makes a kind of sexual advance on the older
Hmm.
one. And at the end, he's like, I wanted you to worship me, but I didn't want you to worship me. So it's like, okay, where's
Right.
the line between like
Hmm.
worshiping this ideal of masculinity and it becoming a sexual kind of fetishization? It's a very thin line, you
So
know?
yeah, let me ask you a question about that kind of because you in the piece you draw a line between eroticism that like deifies strength and one that's like opens us up to suffering. Um, so yeah, what's the difference between that? Like an eroticism that turns inward and on itself versus eroticism that like leads us to God or puts us in a place where we're willing to suffer for the sake of others. Like what? Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, at the root of all erotic desire is this longing for fulfillment, for this kind of completion that ultimately only God can give us. Even if someone's in a heterosexual marriage, like your spouse is not going to give you that fulfillment. They're a sign of that fulfillment, but it's going to come from God.
Sure.
So I think especially for people who like, experience some kind of sexual woundedness in any way, like um erotic desire is not something to be fixed or erased. It's something that you offer. And especially if it's a wounded form of desire, like you can enter into Christ, the cross, his suffering, and turn that desire into a way of I don't know, a channel to like to be of service to others,
Mhm.
to create, especially for people who are artistically inclined, like to create something beautiful, not for the sake of self-indulgence or self-glorification, but to be of service, to give
Mhm.
to others. And I think that's like this is the insight that like Christianity has to offer to this discourse on homofascism, that like, okay, there is something different about homosexuality, homosexual desire. And again, it's either going to lead you towards something very dark, self-indulgent, or towards something very noble, so something very self-sacrificial. And that's why I'm just like, I think Christians need to move away from the identitarian narrative because you miss out on the richness, the like all the possibilities that this experience brings with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think of the like parallel the contrasting narratives of like I don't know, the closeted gay who joins the Nazi movement to
Mm,
feel
yeah.
power and to um but to also kind of hide in some ways like what they feel like is lacking and like and end up being a part of violence in that direction. Whereas I think alternatively of like I don't know, stories of like two men who had never really considered being in a gay relationship, but were in the war in Vietnam, and just because of the like the closeness, like cultivated this companionship amongst themselves that maybe never even was even consummated in some kind of
Mhm.
sexual way,
Yeah.
but it led, but the companionship, the love allowed them to endure hardship
Exactly.
and led to them actually fighting for each other and thinking of each other in their unit more effectively. And like that's a different kind, or being willing to sacrifice themselves to and throw themselves on a grenade to save the lives of the rest of their company, including the person that they like love most dearly. Right? Like
Yeah.
those are two very different stories with similar potentials or similar like original potentials in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there are plenty of stories of people like this where like that bond, that desire becomes not again, it's not something about indulging oneself, fulfilling one's sec selfish desires, but like it becomes a means to give, to sacrifice for the good of the other.
Yeah, yeah.
So again, I think like Christian religious communities need to look for how these experiences can become that vessel, can become that opening to
Yeah.
sanctity.
Yeah. So maybe thinking about some like overlap of our two pieces. I mean, so I wrote about like Gen Z's openness to sober, non-romance idolizing approaches to love, including mixed orientation marriages that like are rooted in kind of the self gift of love as opposed to like erotic chemistry. And then how do you feel like your critique of like eroticized power dynamics and my critique of like romance idolatry might be pointing towards like similar conclusions in some ways,
Uh,
even if
yeah.
using different language?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting way to look at it because yeah, I think like in a sense the liberal secular ideal is characterized by this idolatry of romance that like the fulfillment in life is this sentimental experience that
Hmm.
again like there's no real there's no deeper spiritual foundation. It's just I have feelings for you and then we make a commitment and then we live off of our love. And then again, like you have this other extreme of like, okay, the sentiment is all BS, it's all useless, it's all meaningless. So now let's turn to power. It's not about love and romance, it's about power and dominance. Um, yeah, and but neither really offers something that's actually substantial and fulfilling, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm wondering I don't know. I mean, with like, if in your experiences with younger people who are disillusioned with the kind of romantic ideal, it's not realistic, but who don't opt for this kind of, the fascistic idolatry of power, like, where do you think that where do you think they think real happiness comes from them if it's not from sentiment or power?
Yeah. Right, because it's easy. Maybe they're not, maybe they're disillusioned by some kind of like false hope,
Hmm.
idealism that could be something that could kind of waste years of their life and energies. I think it seems like for Gen Z in particular, more of the temptation is despair, you know,
Hmm.
is to see, well, is there anything good even? What's the point? Is it worth working toward anything? Is it worth, um, but that's kind of like a maybe a uh, on average, maybe true of many people who maybe true of many Gen Zers, or maybe a stereotype. But on the ground, I noticed Gen Z people who, because of their kind of low expectations coming into some things, if they still pursue them, basically in a way that they're employing like God's wisdom, they become pleasantly surprised when
Hmm.
following God's wisdom actually leads to more fullness of life.
Interesting.
There's this
Yeah.
delight that they
Yeah.
basically they didn't expect much, but they were willing to be basically say like, okay, God, I'll like trust you, but I don't expect much. And then they're delighted
Hmm.
when they find like more than they expected. So um I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, and I think this is what's interesting about like the new kind of fluid state of things in our culture today. That like on one hand, it can lead towards real nihilism and despair, the sense that
Mhm.
well, nothing lasts, nothing is solid anymore, which can and plunge people into deep depression. But it also could be like, oh, well, there are so many possibilities. This is something positive. I mean, we could discover something true and lasting, like God. We can rediscover God again.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of, I guess, like circle back to the whole point of like what you're saying about mixed orientation marriages, that like it's ultimately God who takes the initiative. It's God who calls someone to a vocation. It's not our effort. It's not our invention. So like this is why, yes, like I am concerned about like the postmodern fluid culture, but I also think we create a space for God to enter in again, to call us in new ways. Whereas like before, I think when we had all these clearly defined categories, it's like you kind of box God out of the picture. But now,
Mhm.
so yeah, I mean, do you see that though? Like, do you perceive that like this kind of opening to like God entering into the picture again, like calling people in new ways?
Yeah, it does seem like people don't like the lack of order
Hmm.
and um the fluidity of everything, and we could find order in the wrong places. Yeah,
Yeah,
like fascism, for example.
right.
Um but but some are finding, or we can fetishize, for example, high church things, and be in love with the smells and bells more than we're actually in love with Jesus, you
Mm.
know. But it does seem like there's something healthy about saying, I am a human in a disordered, broken, scarcity-ridden, thorny world, and I desire order from the one being who I can trust to bring order to my life in a way that like will be life-giving. The God who knows when to say that's enough or we need more, in just the right ways. So, um, yeah, and I feel like whether it's Christian marriage or it's vocational singleness, there's a way that you could lean into that because you're seeking for God to bring order to the chaos of one's life, but not in a way that we take power, or we are
Yeah.
trying to realize some ideal, but because we trust.
Yeah, this is I think this is like the whole point that like the more like authoritarian, like people more attracted to power to miss that it's again like it's God who's doing the work here. It's like God, it's God's initiative, it's God's agenda that we're following, not our
Mhm.
own. Even if we do it in the name of God, like no, it's we have to be listening for him. We have to be trusting in his call for us. Um, so yeah, I just to kind of wrap things up, I am hoping that like people who read our articles see that just the fact that like the discourse is changing, that new things are happening, like perhaps it may disturb some people in some ways, they may have certain reservations, but like the fact that there's something new is like let's look at how God might use these opportunities to like I don't know to bring new graces into the church, into our experiences, you know. Any last like thoughts or observations before we wrap everything up?
Yeah, I think you're right. The believers, particularly pastors or parents, uh, sh could look at this and find hope in it,
Hmm.
that there's a generation realizing they need more and they want more,
Yeah.
and they could find that in Jesus. And we can make the most, and in the process of like pivoting from disillusionment and trying to grasp at something real, yes, people may try some weird things out. There may be some options out there. There will be some really broken solutions that this world will offer people that will seem pretty wild. But it also mean if the people that also means that like people are hungry and they are looking. And I hope we as the church are willing to be faithful to offer them something uh good. I mean, God has the right solutions. It's whether we're willing to embody them and offer them. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's a good way to close. So Peter, can you, for again, for people who aren't familiar with your work yet, of course they should read the essay that you wrote for us, but where else can they find your work?
Yeah, I'm generally on socials at PIETERLVALK, at Peter L. Valk, with an extra I in my first name. And then in addition to my Substack, I have kind of a personal website kind of parallel to that, that's peterlvalk.com. And people can find a lot of like articles, video articles, essays, reflections, other video content on their other podcasts that I've been on. Some really high quality free content, if people want to continue the conversation there, and can also reach out to me on socials or over email, whatever's most convenient. So, because yeah, I would love to be a resource to whomever.
Yeah. No, and I recommend all our listeners and followers should check out your work because yeah, I mean you're doing very, very innovative, very interesting stuff. And for Peter's followers, yeah, you should check out Cracks and Pomo. We publish interesting stuff like Peter's work. Um, yeah, we're on all the socials, we're on Substack of the pod. But yeah, Peter, I'm happy that we did this collaboration because it's yeah, I mean the conversations that are coming out of this and the reactions we've gotten are yeah, like I love to see the conversation being revived. So yeah, very happy we did this.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey. Thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, I know already I've heard some great things back from some of the people who kind of follow on Instagram and got to read your piece and hopefully started following you on Substack after that because I think there's yeah, really interesting stuff that you guys are posting and on a pretty frequent clip. So yeah,
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Peter.
thank you.